Hello, everyone, and welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I am your host, Liam, aka Himbar, and today I have a special presentation for you. I thought I would do this because there's not a lot of great introductions to philology on the internet, and this is not going to be very technical, so don't worry. I'm trying to make this more applied, but I gave a presentation that is actually this slideshow. I will go through this a little differently, but it is the same slideshow. I have not edited it at all. I'm a little sleepy. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. But this is a presentation I gave a few days ago for the Humanities Society and Art History Association for the local school. And I thought, this would be interesting. I've actually thought about filming a video like this before, and I did actually, and I deleted it because that's not mostly what my channel is focused on. But philology is something I've been in love with for years. It's something I am largely self-taught on, I should preface. I've studied some of this stuff in school, and I'll probably mention that as we get to it. But this is something I just stay up late at night doing while everyone else is asleep. So it is very much something I love. And very much something I see more of in my future. So yeah, let's just get right into it because of course you might not know what philology even is. So an introduction to philology, right? So we have a quote here, which I'm just kind of being cheeky, right? Because unless you speak Old English, then you don't even know what this says. It says there'd be more wisdom in the land, the more languages we knew. Ye Theoda is the languages word here, which is actually on my shirt right here. And this, of course, right, that's just cheeky way of saying it because you probably can't read it yourself. So let's go into what philology actually is, and feel free to criticize any part of this presentation. So according to Drought and Kleinman, philology is an approach to literary studies that uses detailed knowledge of specific languages, dialects, and their workings for the purpose of understanding texts, particularly literary texts, which is not a bad definition. I'd say that's actually rather accurate, as we get language here, dialect, and text. Those are rather important. And then Wiktionary would say it's the humanistic study of historical linguistics, which is also pretty accurate. And then philology is the study of language and oral and written historical sources, is the intersection of textual criticism, literary criticism, history, and linguistics with especially strong ties to etymology. This is from Wikipedia, which I know you might be saying, what the heck? But Wikipedia actually does a decent job here, which they don't always do, of course, but I know a lot of people will look to Wikipedia, so I'm telling you that they do a decent job, at least here. And so basically, that sounds kind of like linguistics, right? And so linguistics is the scientific study of languages. Philology is older than linguistics. These days, you'll often hear historical linguistics as synonymous with philology. Linguistics itself has less tendency to use text, though, and while I would say you need them for historical linguistics, I still like the word philology. There was no real reason to change it to historical linguistics. And then we have just my little thoughts real quick. In short, it is the scientific study and love of language and words. It's culture through language. Because of this, it is closely related to translation, history, and codicology. So a few things here. Philology, of course, is on the side of philosophy and not biology. It is not the study of love. It is the love of logos, which here is generally translated to words. Right? Some will say love of learning, yada yada. So, of course, translation makes sense. History makes sense. You generally get a decent idea of history through these languages, especially, well, you'll kind of see it later. But stuff that may not even be recorded, so like actually prehistory. And then codicology, which for those unaware is the study of codices, so a codex, right? So like manuscript studies type of thing. Not super popular. It's a relatively recent field, but pretty cool, pretty fun if you like that thing. I've actually studied a little bit of codicology myself, just for the relation of philology, actually, because I want to be a better philologist. So anyways, this is kind of a quote. It's not really. It's a rewording done actually by Sigma University, but it says, language is the primary art. This is Tolkien's thing. That is from Nature of Middle-earth, by the way. So there's some famous philologists. I don't know if you'll recognize any of these people, and of course I can't ask you if you do, but if you do, pat yourself on the back. This first one here is Jacob Grimm, or Jakob, one of the brothers Grimm, of course, for their fairy tales. He is one of the most famous philologists probably of all time. And then, of course, the other one is John Ronald Raoul Tolkien. It is Tolkien. not Tolkien, but or Tolkien, but that's okay. You can say Tolkien if you want. That's how I say it. Tolkien, of course, is most famous for his Lord of the Rings books and The Hobbit. But this was his day job. His day job was philology. That was his love. Hence why the languages in Middle Earth are rather well developed compared to most fantasy worlds. And then there's this guy as well. This is kind of just a joke. I like Arthur Gokrais Roeder and his works, his Serkaman and Fadit stories as well. He was the co-writer of In the Grip of the Minotaur. And this guy was a philologist as well. His most famous philological work is The Art of Beowulf, which is actually a response to Tolkien's, I believe, 1936 lecture, The Monsters and the Critics. So I like Broder. I just put him in here because I recognize him. But I'm sure almost no one watching this recognizes him. So anyways, there's a modern history and the comparative method. So philology uses this thing called the comparative method. It is comparative philology, or sometimes you'll hear people say comparative linguistics these days. And it is comparing languages to get older languages and also to see relations, right? And then to find sound changes that get you to different languages and different dialects and whatnot. So William Jones kind of kickstarted this comparative philology thing, and by extension linguistics and European studies, with this statement that you'll see in basically any historical linguistics or philological text. It says the Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of verbs and the forms of grammar, that could possibly have been produced by accident so strong indeed that no philologer could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exist. There is a similar reason, though not quite so forcible, for supporting that both the Gothic and the Celtic, though blended with a very different idiom, had the same origin with the Sanskrit, and the Old Persian might be added to the same family. So Jones was not the first to notice this, but he noticed this because he was studying Sanskrit because he was living in India at the time. And of course, their law was still in Sanskrit. And he was right, actually. And by the way, Gothic here just means German. These are all related. And we're going to see that basically here, then also how English specifically is related to all these as well. The language we're speaking, or I'm speaking, that you're understanding me in. Okay, so I want to explain why this is not super accurate, but it does the job well enough. This is a family tree, a language family tree. This is Proto-Indo-European at the top. It is Proto because it is, there's no record of it. So we don't actually, technically this could not exist, right? Then you'll say, some people who don't like philology will say, this is all bogus and hearsay. It's pretty scientific. It is called the science of the humanities, philology, back in the day. So, and you also realize, though, that this is not super accurate depiction. The original idea was that these Indo-Europeans, whoever they were, right, that they just kind of imploded. It's like all at once they just split into all these groups. They're actually kind of missing Phrygian here as well, but that's a pretty small group. But that's not actually true. From what we know, actually, the first group to break off was Anatolian. Some historical linguists or philologists, whatever, will disagree and say that Anatolian's not actually from Proto-Indo-European. It's probably more like a cousin, was related to Indo-European, but it's not descended from Indo-European. It has some differences, but that could be explained by it being the first one to break off. Right? Anatolian, of course, then spoke in Anatolia. The most famous language would be Hittite. We also have Lycian here, which were the allies of the Trojans during the Trojan War. Luwian would also be in here, which may be the language the Trojans actually spoke. And then we also have Tocharian over here. You might not have heard of this, probably the least common worded one here. Tocharian was spoken. This language, Anatolian's dead, by the way. No one speaks an Anatolian language anymore. Tocharian is also dead. There are no survivor languages, but this was spoken in Western China and the Tarim Basin. It is the furthest east the Indo-European languages go. You do have some subgroups, Indo-Iranian, Celtic, Celto-Italic. They're not connected in this chart, and then Balto-Slavic. We have reason to believe they kind of split together and then split later down the line as well. And then if you go to Germanic over here, you can go to North Germanic, and then you'll find Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish. You go to West Germanic, you'll find, well, probably the most popular Germanic languages. You have English, Frisian, which is the closest related language to English, unless you count Scots as a separate language, but most people wouldn't. And there's Dutch, and then you can go down to Low German, High German, and Yiddish. East Germanic, Gothic, they're all extinct. There's other languages would be like Burgundian, Vandalic, and Lombardian, I believe, Lombardic, um, and probably some others I'm forgetting right now. But uh, yeah. Anyway, so English is a Germanic language, of course, and so it is one of the more popular Proto-Indo-European languages, but this is actually the largest language family in the world. Okay, this is 3 billion people or so speak languages from Proto-Indo-European, so Indo-European language family, um, which is a lot, right? We have Hellenic highlighted down here. That is actually the two main branches, historically speaking, of philology. You have Germanic philology, which makes sense. You're speaking English, and the most philologists back in the day were Germans, so also makes sense. And then you have classical philology, which deals with these two basically, because Latin and Greek are cool, especially for a classical education. Um, of course, if you're a linguist today, you can study any of these. Really, right? If you're from this area, you likely would study any of them, right? So I mean, like, oh, and of course, you could be like doing if you want to do like Hebrew stuff, so Afro-Asiatic languages or Egyptian stuff. There's a lot you can do, of course, but just historically speaking, Germanic was a branch, and then classical philology was a branch. Classical still survives more as a branch, better than Germanic branch does. We'll talk about that, why that is kind of at the end. This is the one I'm more interested in, Germanic stuff. My main interest lies in English. Sorry, I'm tripping over all my words. But yeah, besides Anatolian and Tocharian being the first two, Greek actually was one of the last, which is interesting because Greek actually retains most of the Indo-European vowels without really any changes. And also it cuts off, like you're cutting off Italian down here for the Latin languages. There are more Italic languages, but none of them survive, only Latin does. And then there's Romanian down below as well. Another Italic language would be something like Oscan, which is spoken south of Rome. Like Pompeii has an Oscan name. And then you have like a famous figure named like Pontius Pilate. The P in Pontius is an Oscan name, essentially. It makes it an Oscan name because the Latin version would be Quintius. So, anyways, that is basically this though. But it's again not super accurate as far as timeline goes. You can find more detailed ones, and it'll have like red for dead and green for living type of thing. Okay, so I thought I'd connect this real quick because I do find archaeology interesting. Personally, I was an anthropology major for a while. I would like to study more archaeology along with philology, actually. But we believe the Indo-Europeans were probably these people in this area. It's actually where a war is going on right now. But this is the Pontic Steppe. It's Caspian and Black Seas, Ukraine, Russia, present day, of course. Some people will say that the Caucasus where the Indo-Europeans were, and some will say it was actually Anatolia. Those have some problems with them. The Pontic Steppe seems like the most likely place, and that is what philology proved a century or two ago. It's archaeology that's caught up recently in recent decades and well, kind of reinforces that idea that this is where the Indo-Europeans would have been. This is the Yamnaya culture, which, calling it a culture, some people also disagree with as well. There's differences in the West and there on the East. For example, the East is more male-dominated in their graves, and with their like hearth figure is Agni, right? Would be male, while in the West you have a hearth figure like Hestia, right? So female. You find more females in Western graves as well. This would be I'm just going to generalize and put like a one date here, 3000 BC or so. Now, what's cool about the Yamnaya is that they seemingly are the ones who domesticated horses. They did this for food, but it does also seem like they probably invented horseback riding once they domesticated them. They also seem possibly to be the first that had wheeled vehicles. It doesn't seem like they probably invented the wheel as we think. That probably happened in Mesopotamia, but that was only used for like pottery wheels down in Mesopotamia. So yeah, so they have a lot of innovations. They also drank milk and had dairy products. So a lot of basically Europe's dairy tolerance comes from the Yamnaya, essentially. They also introduced cannabis to Europe. Whether they smoked it is a little bit up in the air, though we have proof that down in the Caucasus they did. So anyways, that's the Yamnaya. We'll just briefly go through these other archaeological cultures. This is the corded ware. I'm tracing this to English, by the way, because again, I'm speaking English. You're understanding me in English. So corded ware, kind of an offshoot from the Yamnaya. This is the battle axe culture. It's even later. This is the Nordic Bronze Age. Um, Their main export would have been amber. Of course, this is around the same time, just for those aware, the Minoans and Mycenaeans. And this is actually the richest culture in Europe, as far as, well, just riches go. And this is the Ostdorf culture. So this Germanic stuff here in this dark green. I don't know if you can see my mouse. So, and then this like burgundy color. That's Germanic. If you go over to the right, you'll see the Balts and Slavs areas. Down in that big orange area is the Celts, which would get much smaller. This is the period that goes right up into the Roman Iron Age. Yeah. So, anyways, the big thing that separates Germanic from all the other languages, right? Because the guy at that quote from the beginning, right? It says, looks like Gothic's probably related to, but with a different idiom, is what he said. And that different idiom is this. So this is named for Jacob Grimm. Grimm's Law. They're called laws because they're actually, and this is kind of where the scientific idea comes from. It's like, they don't change. The laws are like immutable. They are laws, essentially. He wrote about this in his book, Deutsche Grammatik, which has never been translated. You have to learn German if you want to read it. He was not the first to notice this. I believe Rasmus Rask kind of put it into some thoughts, but he's Danish, and he had the idea from a philologist before him as well. But the idea is that these voiceless stops right here become these Germanic fricatives. So these would be p, t, k, becoming f, th, h. And then you have your voiced becoming voiceless. Voice meaning, of course, your vocal cords. If you hold your hand to your voice box, you can tell p, 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 p more specifically, is not voiced. Your vocal cords do not vibrate. But B is the exact same thing as p, but just voiced. So b, b. Of course, all vowels are voiced. So if you say p, you're going to feel a vibration after the p, but if you just do the p, you're not going to feel anything. So these become, again, those, and then the BDG become PTK, and then these aspirated ones down at the bottom, bh, duh, g, they lose their aspiration, essentially. So these are the big changes, and we give some examples here, actually. So we see the shift on the left, and then some examples in Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin where that shift has not happened because it did not go through Grimm's Law. Grimm's Law is only for Germanic languages. And then you see the Grimm's Law modern version, at least in English. So we have pod, which is where we get the word podiatrist from Greek, and then ped, which would be like pedestrian, and then foot in English. And then we have the T to the th, which is a dental fricative, which is actually rather uncommon in languages. But we have tanu, tanaus, excuse me, tenuous, and then thin, and then chatam, I think is that how that would be in Sanskrit. I'm not very good at Sanskrit, sorry. And then hecaton, kentum, or centum if it's classical, ecclesiastical. Classical would be the C's are hard, and then 100. And then there's nothing here for B to P in Sanskrit and Greek, but lubricus to slippery, kind of an interesting example. And then again, we got more. So we got 10, and then acre, we got ager, which is like agriculture stuff going on over here. And then we have frater and brother, and then there's more, right? Widua and widow, and then hanser and goose. What's interesting actually about this one here is goose. If you go to like a Proto-English, you would have a in here. We lose that in. You lose the nasals before some fricatives in English once upon a time. We'll see that on the next picture as well. But for example, the Spanish word for goose actually comes from the Gothic word for goose. I believe the Spanish word is gonzo, which is a lot similar to the Germanic. I don't know why they didn't retain the Latin. The Goths ruled Spain for a while, so that makes sense too. So we have some examples from French specifically, because French, we have a lot of loan words from French and English. So pied, foot, toi, 3, coeur, which is where we get our word core or courage, heart, dent, tooth, dent mean dentures, of course. There's another example. There's that in, that nasal we lose before this fricative here. So tenth, and then grain or gras, right, whatever, corn, frere, which is where we get the word like friar, and then brother, of course. So I thought we'd go through an etymology since, people like that stuff. This is actually a doublet. So we're going to look at language first. So modern English language. I'm skipping Old English, not Old English, sorry. This is not coming in Old English. It comes in Middle English. from French, which is where we get basically all our French words from Middle English, period. And that is Old French langage. This U is just inserted for pronunciation reasons. You don't actually say the U. This would have been coming from Vulgar Latin linguaticum, Classical Latin lingua, Old Latin dingua, Proto-Indo-European dingu. So a few notes here. This asterisk with the linguaticum in this Proto-Indo-European root is what it is. Proto-Indo-European is a root-based language. So there might be an actual word that meant tongue here, but this is the root where we would have gotten tongue. The actual word would probably be argued over by a lot of people. But this asterisk means it's not written down anywhere. So Vulgar Latin is a spoken language. Classical Latin is a written language. Some I've actually seen asterisks on dingua over here with Old Latin, but I've also seen it written down. So dingua, that's actually a rather weird sound change, I think, of a D to an L. And this also, for those curious in Proto-Indo-European, this in is a vowel. It is acting as a vowel. I'm not entirely sure how to say that, but I think I said it okay. And so then we have a doublet. So a doublet is something that has the same origin, means they're cognates, right? Another example would be crib and creche in English. So we have modern English tongue, which has, well, it has this weird spelling. It should look like a lung and rung, like T-U-N-G, but we don't spell that way because of reasons. And then we have Middle English tunga, and Old English tunga, and then pre-West Germanic tunga, and then Proto-Germanic tungo, which again comes from Proto-Indo-European dingu. Now, this is Old English, so there's a lot of Old English written, actually. It's one of the earlier Germanic languages written down. Definitely not the earliest. That would be Gothic. But this stuff over here is not stuff we see written down. The West Germanic, which is where, Germanic, this Proto-Germanic would have split into the West, North, and Eastern dialects. So, yeah. Anyways, and then we kind of see that these words are cognates, but they're in an odd friendship. I use that word on purpose, since language cannot denote the body part, and generally tongue itself does not mean language unless you're reading old things, like the Bible, where, tongue can mean language, but it generally doesn't mean that today. I use it sometimes, but I'm a writer as well. So, but language, again, does not denote the body part, and it will not. I believe also modern French has the word language, or langage, and then langue as well, which does denote both language and the body part. Langue does. But one note as well, I made a video about this once, but the difference between false cognates and false friends, for those unaware, false friends is a term we use when we're looking at other languages. It is a word that looks like a word from your language, but it does not mean the same thing. Now, I've heard people call false friends false cognates, and that's not entirely true, because a cognate means co-natal, if you just look at the word. So the common example is embarazado in Spanish, which means pregnant, but it looks like embarrassed in English, which obviously means embarrassed. And so they are related. They actually are cognates, but they are false friends, because if you think embarazado means embarrassed, well, you'd be wrong, at least in modern Spanish. So that's what I mean by this odd friendship here, because we generally don't use these words, language and tongue, for the same things anymore. But they're definitely doublets, and they are cognates. Okay, so then I have some fun examples. This is more for the application bits of things. I like poetry. I've actually mentioned probably all these poems at some point on my channel, but I thought I'd go through them real quick. So here is a poem. I forgot to put titles, by the way, but this is The Love Unfeigned by Geoffrey Chaucer. You might recognize it as English, right? It looks pretty much like English. Yeah, it's basically a sonnet as well, and it rhymes. So that looks like English poetry. And it's an iambic pentameter. So that's English stuff. It's a lot of stuff we associate with Shakespeare. This is before Shakespeare, of course, Geoffrey Chaucer, and because of that, because it's before Shakespeare, it is before the Great Vowel Shift, which is where we get modern English. So Shakespeare is not Old English. We would call him early modern English. This is not Old English either. This is Middle English. It looks pretty recognizable. Spelling has not solidified here yet, as you can tell. You're going to recognize most of these words, I think, either way, though. You might have problems with thilka, which is a contraction of the like. It means that, generally. You might have a problem with, like, wheat, which I don't know, that can mean a few things, but kind of like ghost almost. Um, and then, yeah, I don't know if you'd have any problem. Repaireth means repaireth, but we probably wouldn't use it that way. But you can recognize if you've read like King James Version of the Bible or anything like that, the eth endings, obviously. But it is phonetic. So I will read this to you, at least part of it, so you can get an idea of what Middle English sounds like. Now, I should specify this is a London dialect. This is where our language comes from. If you read some earlier Middle English and from different dialects, it will sound a lot less familiar to you. And so we have, well, here's what it sounds like. O jonge freshe folkes, her she, in which that love upgroweth with your age, repaireth home from worldly vanity, and of your heart upcasteth the visage, to thilke God, that after his image, Yahweh mad, and thinketh all nis but to fire, this world that passeth soon as flowers fire, and loveth him that which that riecht for love, upon a cross our souls for to bear, first starve, and the rose, and sit in heaven above, for he near falsen, no wicht, daar Isaiah, that war his herte all holy on him leia, and sin he best love is and most maker, what needeth feigned love is for to sake. I think that's an absolutely beautiful poem. I want to memorize this one. Another thing that you might have had a problem with is starve. It means starve, right? But it just means die, just generally speaking. So he dies and he rose, sits in heaven. So it's about Christ. Very Christian poem. His most famous work, of course, would be the Canterbury Tales, which is just amazing. One of the best pieces of literature ever. And you should go read it. And we have Old English over here. Again, I forgot the title. But this is called Cadman's Hymn. It is the first Christian poem in English. That's probably bogus. It might be the first Christian, but it's definitely not the first poem in English. It seems like it's the oldest one we have preserved, though. It's really simple. It's really straightforward. You're not going to notice any rhyme, though, here. Not iambic pentameter. Old English meter is divided into two half lines, and they alliterate. I'm not going to get all into the meter here. But the best way to look at the alliteration, I would say, is probably this last line, Firum Foldan Freya Almichti. So you see the three F's here. Now, this is also Christian in the theme, but it has a little bit of a difference that we'll probably talk about after I read it to you real quick. I actually have this memorized, but I use a slightly different, I'm more used to the word Eldr Bernum rather than Erthan Bernum. But anyways, it says, Nu schulan herian heaven riches werd, metodus machta and is moja thank. Werk woeder vader swahe wundre je was, eche driktan, ora stelda. Her shop, erde beanum, heaven rofar hali shippend, da midden jeert mon kines werd, eche drikten after Theoda, firam foldan, Freya amichti. So you'll recognize that this is not super recognizable. This is the same from the quote on the first page, actually. So this is what we call Old English. This, I believe, is a more Northumbrian dialect. But if I point a few things out to you, you'll probably notice some similarities. So new means now. Shulan is shall. Heaven reaches is heaven reaches, or like German word Reich. Like Hitler's Third Reich. Yeah. Or werd, or water. Depending on how you say that. That the jury's out on that one, but it's ward, right, or guardian or warden, like at a prison or something. Methodus means measurer. This is a word for God, generally. Motithank is mind thoughts. Work is work. Wudler father is glory father. Each hymn of wonders. We'll look at the translation here in a second. But eternal Lord. So he creates heaven as a roof. This is actually an interesting thing to note. Actually, this is a very literal translation, or very literal idea based off Genesis, where it says God created the heavens and the earth. And so they're like, oh, he created the heavens first, obviously, because the scriptures say heaven before earth. And, that's a miracle in and of itself, right? Because when humans have to build stuff, they build the foundation and then the building and then the roof, right? But God, no, he's too cool for that. He's miraculous, so he can build the roof first. That's basically what this is saying. And then he shapes Middle Earth for mankind. Now, a few notes here actually as well. Midan that's how it's said. Now, this is where Tolkien gets his idea of Middle Earth. Midan would be Middle yard sounds kind of lame. This is cognate with mid-guard. It's the exact same thing. This GE in English becomes a Y sound. Same up here, herian. But it's yard in English. Yard sounds less cool though. Garth, garden mean the same thing as well. And then we have other sound things. So mon kines word. So this Y is an E sound, so what an I would make phonetically. But it's rounded lips. I believe it's the same sound as a German U with an umlaut on it. I'm not 100% sure on my German there though. CEs, so it's a C with a front vowel basically, becomes a ch. This would be a CH in modern English. SC, like in Schulan, is SH. There's very few examples where SC is actually a sk, but it's generally SH sound, what we associate with an SH. Also, we have in mode ythunk, the last word in the second line, that fourth to last letter is called a thorn. It makes a TH sound. It's a dental fricative. It can also make the th, voiced or unvoiced, doesn't really matter. Erathon is like what we call an eth. The thorn is a rune. The eth is from Gaelic influence, and they both make the same sound, and they're interchangeable. You can use whatever one you want. And then another one, Firam Foldan Freya Almichtis. Freya is cognate with the Norse Freyr. Almichti is Almighty. Now you'll notice that it's kind of a Christian poem, but it actually doesn't mention God anywhere. This is a poem that would probably be used to entertain Christian audiences and pagan audiences. This is a translation. Now we must praise the keeper of the heavenly kingdom, the power of the measurer, and his mind thoughts, the work of the glory Father, as he, each of wonders, the eternal Lord, established from the beginning. He first shaped for the children of men, heaven as a roof, the holy shaper, then middle earth, mankind's guardian, the eternal Lord afterwards created the earth for men, the Lord Almighty. So these are both very Christian poems, but that's the Middle Ages in a nutshell for you. You'll get rather heroic themes too. We'll actually look at one in a minute, and a lot of Old English stuff is actually heroic too. Same with Middle English as well, just romantic. So here is a, for the classical side, I don't have any Greek in here, sorry, if anyone cares about that. This is from Catullus, but Catullus 5, remembering correctly. I thought I'd just go over a little bit if you're curious about some Latin. I'm not going to read the whole thing, it gets really redundant. But vivamus mea lesbia atque amemus, rumesque senum sebrior. Omnes unius astemamus assis, soles accidere et vedere possunt. All right, so you'll notice that classical Latin has a V that is pronounced like a W, and in Church Latin, it is a V sound. That is a very common sound change from a W to a V. German did this. Norman French did this. Old Norse did this. If you're reading Old Norse text, those V's, if they're older, are a W sound. They are V later. Very common sound change. Does not happen in English, though. So, but this is Latin. I don't know. I took Latin in school, so it just looks similar to me. This is, we, right, live. So let us live, my lesbia, and love, right? And the rumors of rather stern old men. Let us value all at just 1 penny. So not at all, right? Suns may set and rise again. I actually like this line. And for us, when once the brief line has set, an eternal night must be slept. So then they're going to kiss each other a million times. That's Catullus. He's got some rather raunchy stuff. This is actually one of his more tame poems. Excuse me. Yeah, but that's a classical thing. Again, if any of you have questions, since I don't actually have people here to raise hands and ask questions right now, you can just leave something in comments, and if I know the answer, I'll answer it for you. Okay, so more for the classical side of things. We're going to French this time. So Les 1 of the Song of Roland, or as in French is known as La Chanson de Roland. We have the Old French. This one's a little tougher for me, but I think I can say this pretty well. It's Charles Liges, notre empereur Magnès, se danse tous plaines à l'Esteth en Espagne, jusqu'à la mer conquiste la terre Altagne, ni un chaster qui devant lui commande, menace tête ni es remède à fendre. Vos sargus qu'est et une montagne, Liges massali la tient, qui du nen émeth, Mahumeth certes et parlons avec le meth, nes port grauder quel mals ne little antagneth. So a few things you'll notice. This looks a lot more like Latin, I think, than it does modern French. Now, in the Old French period, the French would have said they spoke Latin. They would not have said they spoke French. They just spoke Latin, right? And it makes sense because it was Latin until linguists came along, 1,000 years later and said, no, you weren't speaking Latin. You were speaking Old French at this point. And they're all dead, so who cares? But this is about Charlemagne, of course. And Charles is Charles, right? This is pretty similar to the modern English pronunciation. This ch comes from the CA. The CAs in French, which come from Latin, become a ch sound, and then eventually in modern French, a sh. You generally don't go from ka to sha. You'd go from ka to cha to sha. That's a decently common sound change as well. English got it, like I said, with that. The C's with the front vowels, we get so, but at a certain point, we had it as well. And then lires, notre, I believe this S would not be said at this point. Employer manies, this G should not be said. I believe that's the same thing, classical Latin. The most interesting, I think, thing is probably this word in the T is death. Imeth, reclameth, atteneth. That is actually, don't forget it, that's a TH sound. For 2 centuries, this is 11th century poem. Old French had a TH sound for a couple centuries, and that was it. French does not have one now. If you see a TH in French now, it is a T. And yeah, that's actually a rather uncommon sound for those unaware. There's not very many languages, at least in the standard version of languages, that have a TH. English is one of the few. Icelandic has one as well. And so I think Greek does. I'm not entirely sure. So anyways, here's a modern French. I'll read a part of it. This is a translation by Ian Short. Charles le Roi, le grand notre empereur, cet homme entier est resté en Espagne jusqu'à la mer conquis le terre. Aucun château devant lui résiste. Un ennemi ni cité qui reste à forcer. Sauf Sargos qui est sur une montagne. Montagna. You could say Montagna, I guess. Le Roi Massile. I'm not sure. This is the guy's name. Latien qui n'aime pas du. C'est Mahomet qui c'est un prion qui invoque. Il n'en peut mais le malheur le frapperait. A lot of practice, my French. So someone please butcher me for my pronunciation of that. But in English, for those who, by the way, this is not how we would, this is not politically correct. I should maybe specify, but that is the case with ancient languages. So Charles the King, this is Charlemagne, right? Carlos, something like that, and probably the language he spoke, whether that's Latin or some Germanic, Frankish tongue. Our mighty emperor has been in Spain for all of 7 years. He has won that haughty land down to the sea. There's no castle still opposing him, nor town or wall remain to be crushed, except a mountain city, Saragossa. Marcilla holds it. He does not love God, but serves Muhammad and invokes Apollo, which is obviously not very understanding of what Muslims actually worship. But yeah, so you can see that's a medieval problem we got there. But that's a fun one, I think. And so here's a video I'm going to recommend, since I'm not going to show it to you, obviously, in my video. But if you go to Mythmoot 4, they're about to have their next Mythmoot. It's like 9 or 10. Invoking Wonder. Michael Drought gives a great little thing, like I'm doing right now, basically, on Germanic philology. This is a lot more entertaining. He's a lot more charismatic than I am. But you might want to watch that. So, yeah, Michael Drought. So I'm going to go over some cool discoveries, what I would call cool discoveries. We'll see if you think they're cool. More recent. No, these ones aren't recent, actually. I remember. Let's see. So Edward Sievers, he's mostly known for his Germanic meter stuff and Old English. He had a text with him, which we call Genesis, Old English Genesis, and he realized it was actually originally from 2 separate texts. So he had Genesis A, which is the beginning and the end, and then Genesis B, so there's a section in the middle. And he's like, Genesis B is not the same as the rest of this. So he hypothesized, and I said I'm here, oops, in the 1870s, that the Old English version of this B section was taken from an Old Saxon original. And in 1894, a fragment of an Old Saxon Genesis was found in the Vatican and matched the Old English word for word. Sievers was correct. He guessed it. That's because philologists know way more than I do. Here's another example. Actually, sorry. That same Genesis is likely an inspiration for Paradise Lost. This is not confirmed. Don't know if it can be. The guy who owned the manuscript that Genesis found is called the Junius manuscript. It's named for Franciscus Junius. He's a Dutch man, um, a long time ago, contemporary with John Milton, and they were actually buddies. In Genesis B, Satan is a lot more relatable, right? Which is something that we see in Paradise Lost. So there's a chance he got this idea for his Satan, his Lucifer, from this Genesis B, which is written in Old English, of course. But again, originally from Old Saxon. So we have similarly Ferdinand de Saussure hypothesized that the existence of pharyngeals in Proto-Indo-European, but they could not be found in any data in descendant languages. Basically, he looked at all the languages. He didn't see any pharyngeals, but what he was looking at is like there had to be this sound we're calling pharyngeal, which I'm not going to repeat for you because I don't know how to do it. So that was until the early 20th century when Hittite was deciphered. Oh, and Hittite has pharyngeals in it. So again, another example. There's a few other examples I could think of, but we will not go over them. So yeah, so again, another example of a philologist knowing what they were talking about and being proven right later. It showed that the method works. Still does, by the way. Anyways, so then there's some modern fun stuff you can read. I feel like it's fun. You might find it terrible. The Merovingian, again, Damnatio Memoriae, and the Usus Scalorum by Tom Shippey. I love Tom Shippey. This is actually kind of a refutation. This guy is not a philologist, but he's kind of refuting Mr. Shippey, Professor Shippey, on other grounds, as against the Damnatio Memoriae, at least. The name Merovingian and the Dating Beowulf by Walter Goffart, which is a terrible last name. Philological Inquiries. I'm sure it's a great last name, sorry. Which again goes along, these first two are kind of related. Method of Merovingians by Michael D.C. Drought and Scott Kleinman. This one's free online. I know you can read this one by Tom Shippey at the top on academia.edu. This third one is on the Heroic Age academic journal site. And I don't remember where I read Walter Goffard's version. But this fourth one is probably my favorite philological work, probably favorite academic article I've ever read. The Emendation Erla, Heruli and Beowulf, line 6a, setting the poem in the named lands of the north. That is a quote. Quotations, the named lands of Lord of the North, from Tolkien. This again by Michael Drought, but also Nelson Jering this time. So this is an idea that a lot of your older manuscripts are copies from older manuscripts. And that's whoever copied Beowulf didn't recognize this word, and so it's been amended. So that word is er. It's generally amended to erlas because it's saying that he overthrew the earl. Right, basically, that's what the Danes did. They overthrew the earl. That sounds really weird. So it's like, okay, well, you overthrew the earls. That's what erlas means, right? Which also I think sounds kind of weird. So Jering and Drought do a great job of connecting that this should not have been Erl, but should have been Erla, and that the scribe would not have recognized it because just so much time had passed, it would not have remembered the Heruli, which is the Latin name. Again, the Heruli are a tribe native to Denmark, if I remember correctly, and neighbors to the Danes. That got destroyed, basically, just to put it, accurately. Sorry, my thing clicked, but this would make sense. He overthrew the Heruli. That would make a lot of sense for starting the poem. Makes your host look a lot cooler, that's for sure. And then it's really great. This will get really technical, and you'll see why philology is called the science of the humanities. And then we have Beowulf in the North Before the Vikings by Tom Shippey. This is a recent book. It's very fun. The idea of Vikings being Scandinavian people is just bogus. Just because you're Scandinavian does not mean you're a Viking. Viking is an occupation. It is an occupation that was very popular for Scandinavians in the Viking Age, but it was also a thing beforehand, seemingly at least, hence why England seemed to be colonized by Germanic tribes. But Tom Shippey will talk about some of this stuff, some things we get from Beowulf, and an idea of what this early medieval world might have looked like. This is more on the religious side of things on the bottom. It is more on the Greek. I would say Greek philology. Relational grace. This kind of takes the word grace as it appears in the New Testament. It's kind of against most of the Christian world's view of grace. But he has some philological arguments some archaeological evidence as well that goes along with it. I've not read the whole thing. Brent J. Smith, I realize I need a space between Brent and J as well. It's very interesting, though. And then I have another modern example. This is more active for participation, and that is he is Odin's man. So this is a Bracteate, sorry, discovered in the Vindalifjord in 2022. It puts proof of Odin worship. Odin worship to the early 5th century. It is a late 6th century. Was the previous date, right? So. This runic reconstruction right here, by the way, don't take 100%. I had to copy and paste this stuff online. I believe you would have read this backwards as well, but it says, is Woldenaz whereas. My runes are pretty close on, but not entirely. So we have this S rune for the second Z, and then the N, I don't know, it looks more like a U rune to me, but that's what they're saying it is. Anyway, so what does this mean? Well, it means exactly what it says up top. He is Odin's man. Is not present. Is the first word here does not mean is. So it's probably a little confusing. It means he. You actually see this in German which means he in modern German. You don't get this word surviving at all in English. I think it survived grammatically at some things in Old English, but not lexically at all. So when you have a sound go from Z to S to an R, it's called a rhoticism. It's actually a pretty common sound change as well. Hence German from is. Then you have Wodenaz, which is Odin. We get the name Odin from Norse, and Norse lost W's at the beginning of words. So like their word for worm is Orm. And then Odin is Odin, right? But it's Woden in Old English, and it's Wodenaz here in this early Germanic. We actually expected there to be a vowel between this eth and n. It was not, which is very interesting. Yeah. So, anyways, and then whereas is man, as in werewolf. The whereas as in were and werewolf. The word man in something like Old English, man, just meant person, meant people, which is why the idea of mankind being a sexist term is a very recent one, because it just means people kind, just means people. It's a very Germanic, old-fashioned word, rather than just saying people. People comes from French, populi. But yeah, anyways, so he is Odin's man. This is recent stuff, right? This was just figured out a few months ago. And they had a copy of this Bracteate as well before, but it was so badly faded they couldn't read it. And this is actually really difficult to read as well, these runes. I don't know if you're me. You're having difficulty reading this. The figure on the Bracteate seems to be some leader of some sort, some noble or king. I believe this hoard is found in Denmark. I could be mistaken. Interesting. That looks like kind of like a Filfolt here or swastika, which is, an idea actually that potentially the Nazis got from stuff like this. We'll actually talk about the Nazis for a second here at the end and what happened to philology. So why study philology? So I think, for me personally, I've often been told to study history to learn about the past, but specifically learn about yourself from past people and use it as guidance for today's problems. And we're often told to study other peoples for more understanding. And this was meant for humanities people, so that's done well enough to humanities, right? But and learning another language, though, is a part of this, right? So, for example, I mentioned earlier, we know more about the ancient Indo-Europeans for a while there because of philology, right? It was way ahead of archaeology. And then reading a text, though, in the original words is just so special. And then, so philology has this tendency to be powerful, right? And studying history and worldviews together because, a different language has a different worldview. And it's a dead language, so it's history, right? So, and it'll also tell you about words you'll speak every day, right? Like recently I learned that there's two legendary founders of Kent, or kind of as England as a whole, some would say, but Hengist and Horsa. Hengist, some people would say. And Horsa means horse, obviously. Hengist means stallion, and horse obviously survives as a word. Hengist doesn't really, but it does in the word henchman. Henchman just means horseman or stallion man. So it's like a stable boy type of thing, hench. So learned that one recently. And then you can do this as well. So you can connect bodhisattva, which is again a Sanskrit term. It is a Buddhist idea, um, to English bodh. The English word bodh is related to bodhisattva. They sound like they are related. Bodh does not come from Sanskrit. It's an native English word. They're related. All right. You also discover words like ghost and guest and host. We're all originally the same word. Some might say that ghost is not, but it's pretty well believed that guest and host are. Host we get from French. Guest is the native word, and they mean the opposite thing in our language, but in Indo-European, they would have meant the same thing. Of course, there is this like the sacred relationship of hospitality and reciprocity with a guest-host relationship. You see it actually really well in Indo-European context with the Iliad, with Glaucus and Diomedes, who they realized when their granddads had this guest host relationship, that they stopped killing each other. And then, of course, if this ghost word is connected, though, a ghost would have just originally meant a visitor, right? And then if you look at Tolkien's work, you can get dragon Smaug in Smachol, but we'll just say Smeagol, and Smeals, which, if you're not remembering, Smeals are the hobbit holes that are not built in the actual hills. They're the hobbit holes that are like built like a mound type of thing. You put a house in there. It comes from the Old English word Smeal. Remember, the GE is like a Y sound. And they all come from this Proto-Germanic word smugan, which means to creep. And so Tolkien would put a lot of stuff like this into his works. A lot of times his names in his works will not just have a Germanic meaning, they'll have an actual Elvish meaning as well. That you can tell he's taking it from a real Germanic word, but he's giving it an in-world explanation as well from like Elvish. He does the same thing with Saruman as well. And then so here's some sources to study philology. So there are no textbooks for philology, never have been. Philology was taught with this teacher-apprentice method. It was required in many universities up until after World War II. Harvard dropped their Germanic philology courses, no longer teaching the history of the English language, which would be a basic form of it. This is kind of a dumb reason as far as I've been able to find. There's not a lot of sources on this, but we know the Romantics, if you know the Romantic period, that they were obsessed with nationalism. This came during the Romantic period, like a lot of fields did, of course. So the thing with during that Romantic period is that we talked about where this Indo-European homeland is likely to have been. A lot of people back then wanted it to be where they were, right? And so, of course, that meant the Germans wanted it to be in Germany. Obviously it wasn't in Germany, but this idea also, continues and is later used in like the ideology of the Nazis. As far as I'm aware, I've never seen that any philologist came out as a Nazi sympathizer or a Nazi. But it was easy to say, oh yeah, Nazis bad. They liked philology. I don't like philology. I never liked philology. It's more from the people in some ways that liked Nazis at first until it came out that they were bad, obviously. Like so bad that you can't agree with them at all or else you're going to lose a ton of face. And then you have like, well, I like philology gets a lot of grant money or something. And then you're like, well, I want the grant money, so let's stab philology in the back type of thing, essentially. Virtue signaling at its finest, it's not a new thing. So that basically killed philology. It just ended it, essentially. The only school you can actually take a Germanic philology, like course type thing, is Sigma University, and that's only been created in the last 10 years. The only other course you can take a philology thing, something that's actually called philology still, in the United States is classical philology, and that's at Harvard. Of course, are linguistic courses, though. And so for Signum, again, this is meant for undergrads, but you can get certificates from them, and you can get a master's degree. But if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you can audit classes as well. It costs about $90, if I remember correctly. It's on sale a lot, though. You get Introduction to Old English, Philology through Tolkien, which will connect Tolkien's work with his philological work. Introduction to Germanic Philology, you get Chaucer, Introduction to Old Norse, Gothic, and so forth. There's actually a decent Coursera MOOC from Leiden University, who has a really good linguistics program called Introduction to Comparative Indo-European Linguistics. This is the same problem. Even though it's historical linguistics, they have like no text in this MOOC, but it's still good stuff. Like I learned, for example, the Hittite word merzi, which means to disappear, shows that Anatolian stuff came from an earlier version of Proto-Indo-European, because in all other versions, all the cognates to merzi and all the other Indo-European languages have a more specific meaning, which is to die. So like mort, from Latin, or murder in English. They give a similar example for Tocharian. The word for stone is more specifically a millstone, and like all the later Indo-European languages as well. So generally, you don't generally go from specific to broader in language. You go from rather broad to more specific, right? So yeah, and this is a class that's just on campus, the last one. So, and they got a few more. These are books mostly. So you have an introductory grammar of Old English. There are a lot of Old English grammars out there. This one you can actually find for free digitally online, by R.D. Folk. He is very philological minded. So we'll see in the first couple chapters if you're ready for that. It won't really hold your hand. Like I said, this was not a very technical presentation, but he tackles it like a philologist. And then he has the follow-up, a history of Old English meter, a history of Old English literature. And of course, if you're interested in Old English like I am, you can find similar books. Like I have an introduction to Old French, I have Latin grammars, I have an introduction to Old Occitan if you want to read the songs of the troubadours, which is awesome, right? And then you have Old English Philology, which is a festschrift edited by a bunch of people: Leonard Neidorff, Raphael J. Pasquale, and Tom Shippey. Then you have Old English and its closest relatives, which might be one of the better recommendations if you want to look at in more philological lens, because it'll look at English, but also the Germanic languages, basically. It'll tell you that French is not closely related to English. English is very much a Germanic language. It has about as much of the core vocabulary of English has changed at about a rate. I think it's like, if you look at the 250 most common English words, at about a rate of 19% over the last 1,000 years, which is less than, I think, the change between like the relatability between like Spanish and like Italian or something. So I mean, like, it's still very much an English language. We have a lot of French vocabulary, but grammatically it's Germanic. And then you have this book, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language by David W. Anthony. It's about 15 years old, I think, at this point. This guy is an archaeologist, but he does a decent job with his linguistics. He really tries, and this is the thing I wish more people did. That's one thing I like about Tom Shippey as well, that he is a philologist, but he tries to integrate archaeology in his work. This is the opposite for Anthony here. He is an archaeologist, and he tries to integrate philology into his work. This is more of an Indo-European thing. But if you find that fascinating like I do, you'll love this book. So that's basically it, though. My voice is dying. Yeah. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope I shared good information for you, and that it's entertaining. Maybe you'll learn something new. If you think I got anything wrong, just let me know. Maybe I shouldn't be ending that. That's just my. I'm all conscious about what I feel like I don't know, because when you're self-taught, you're gonna have gaps in your knowledge. But as far as it goes, I feel like I got most of the stuff right here, so that's good. Or else I wouldn't be putting it on YouTube. But yeah, that's just a little introduction to philology, something that's more applied, I felt like, than going through a bunch of etymologies. But language change is a very fascinating thing. So something like Grimm's law is something you would look at a lot. There's a bunch of other laws, depending on which language you're looking at, like Grassmann's law or Werner's law or whatever it is. So there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot of cool places you can learn it. I'm always down to learn more of it. I am constantly learning more of it. I have books surrounding me with this stuff as a topic. So, but anyways, maybe you have a better idea of what philology is now than you did beforehand. And just at the core, it is a love of words, right? And so I can say that I am Liam from Liam's Lyceum, and I love words. Okay, I always put I'm an aspiring philologist on most of my social media places. And yeah, anyways, so again, hope you learned something. I'll catch you next time.